Today, never trust the government. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Welcome to this post covering finance and property news. Well, in our surveys, we include a question on whether households trust the federal and state governments to do the right thing for them, and specifically relating to housing. And the answer is a resounding no. The question of whether we do trust those elected officials who theoretically at least should be looking after our interests seem to highlight that in many countries from Australia, the UK, Canada, New Zealand and America, governments are frankly on the nose. Perhaps this is one reason why there are attempts in train to close down free speech, as illustrated by the misinformation and disinformation bill currently on the books in the Australian Parliament. See my earlier post about this mad bill and why it must be resisted. In our surveys, we find many households struggling with rising costs and flat real incomes and the ability to get ahead or to find a place to live, and even more pressure on family relationships as a result. In other words, many blame bad government policy for their own predicaments, and they are frankly right. The recently released report on government action during the COVID period cuts to the heart of the question of trust, as a 3-person inquiry panel slammed the approaches towards such issues as lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and school and border closures, saying they lacked transparency and compassion and were often not evidence-based. Now, let me say straight away that the scope of this inquiry was deliberately hobbled to avoid some key questions around vaccines and other issues, which is in itself shameful. But even so, the Covid-19 inquiry found that heavy-handed, inconsistent and insensitive pandemic restrictions meant people were unlikely to accept such measures again. And frankly, they also stuffed the economy and stuffed the housing market. Economic modelling presented to the inquiry found that inflation could have peaked at around 6% instead of 8% in December 2022 if the federal government's more than $300 billion worth of pandemic spending and the Reserve Bank of Australia's near-zero interest rate policies were less stimulatory. With the benefits of hindsight, there were excessive fiscal and monetary policy stimulus provided through 2021 and 2022, especially in the construction sector, the inquiry said. Now, of course, the outlook for the economy in March 2020 was bleak and highly uncertain. Covid-19 had been declared as a pandemic. Many countries were shuttering their borders and restricting businesses and the movement of individuals to slow the spread of Covid-19. This would have caused significant financial disruption to the global economy and specifically in financial markets. But I've held the view for a long time that because China acted first with heavy-handed lockdowns, it became easier for Western governments to follow suit, even if it cut across the traditional personal freedoms and even the rule of law. Now, the report said that at the outset of the Covid-19 pandemic, Australians largely did what was asked of them and complied with public health orders that significantly restricted their movements and freedoms. This reflected a high level of trust in government that increased at the beginning of the pandemic, together with a general fear of personal harm and a willingness to make individual sacrifices for the collective good. But as the pandemic wore on and the national approach sought by the Morrison government fragmented, this goodwill was squandered. The challenge before us is to re-establish and build trust in government responses prior to any future public health emergency, the report said. We cannot assume that the public will comply with similar restrictions in a future public health emergency. In particular, people's willingness to comply with a near-term crisis will depend on experiences during the COVID-19 pandemic. Any government will need to work hard to regain community trust, and given the current government's track record, it's clearly going to be a long road back. But today, I want to delve into specific observations about how bad government policy caused inflation and crueled the property market, and the RBA, of course, also has a share of the blame too. The 12-month inquiry, which was led by public sector expert Robin Crook, epidemiologist Catherine Bennett, and health economist Angela Jackson, And they released a report running to more than 860 pages, and it provides a series of actions for government and 9 guiding recommendations. One critical observation was that the pandemic was one of the biggest disruptions to the economy ever recorded, prompting $213.7 billion worth of government spending. The reviewer said that the economic side of the crisis needed early attention, and careful planning will add to value for money in future events. Like other countries, there was too much economic stimulus in 2021 and 2022, including in the construction sector. The report said that spending contributed to inflation. It says JobKeeper was the biggest ever spending program by a government, but the lack of planning led to delays, costing more jobs. In addition, some policy decisions, such as excluding temporary migrants and foreign companies from JobKeeper, exacerbated skill shortages and inflationary pressures during the economic recovery. The review also found that the post-pandemic inflation and house price crisis were a consequence of the Reserve Bank of Australia cutting interest rates too hard and the federal government spending too much by outlaying $213 billion in COVID-related assistance and stimulus measures. With the benefit of hindsight, there was excessive fiscal and monetary policy stimulus provided through 2021 and 2022, especially in the construction sector, the report said, finding that inflation peaked 2 percentage points higher than it needed to. Combined with supply-side disruptions, this contributed to inflationary pressures coming out of the pandemic. Now, Treasurer Jim Chalmers used the report to attack his predecessors for the inflation problem he inherited. Global supply shocks are a big part of the inflationary challenges, but that was compounded by some poor policy choices during the pandemic. But former Treasurer Josh Frydenberg said that Dr. Chalmers' attempts to rewrite history is not supported by the facts. At every opportunity during COVID, Labour wanted to spend more, extending JobKeeper, expanding taxpayer assistance to wholly foreign government-owned companies, and even wanted to buy an airline, he added. Now, the report lauded the JobKeeper wage subsidy as pivotal in the health and economic response, but said having to design the policy in the midst of a crisis rather than having a plan ready to go increased job losses and created necessary compromises in policy design that reduced the value for money for taxpayers. In addition, some policy decisions, such as excluding temporary migrants and foreign companies from JobKeeper, exacerbated skill shortages and inflationary pressures during the economic recovery. The report said a stronger focus on supply-side policies in the plans for the economic recovery would have mitigated some of the post-pandemic inflationary pressures. Interestingly, an earlier report by former senior Treasury official Nigel Wray concluded the $88.8 billion JobKeeper scheme played a crucial role steering the Australian economy through the pandemic, despite a handful of costly design flaws. Mr. Ray said that JobKeeper should be more flexible, allowing eligibility to switch from prospective to retrospective revenue criteria after 3 months, minimising the prevalence of profitable firms receiving the subsidy. This would have allowed better targeting of payments beyond the initial 3 months and lowered the cost of the program. Treasury said back in 2021 that the decision not to include a clawback mechanism was to support confidence and to maximise the take-up and reduce uncertainty. Greater transparency about who received JobKeeper would have also improved the scheme's targeting, Mr. Ray's report said. At least $260 million in JobKeeper payments were voluntarily repaid by some of Australia's largest public companies after the event. But the new inquiry said JobKeeper was crucial but poorly targeted. The cash flow boost for small businesses with turnover below $50 million offered credit totaling between $20,000 and $100,000 when they lodged their tax activity statements in 2020. Given that the payment was so quickly overtaken by JobKeeper payment, it is difficult to assess its impact and whether it represented value for money for taxpayers. It has also not been subject to a review, so it is difficult to assess its effectiveness, they said. Now, separately, the Reserve Bank of Australia recently reviewed the term funding facility. The goal of the TFF was twofold: to reinforce the benefits to the economy of a lower cash rate, by reducing banks' funding costs and in turn helping to reduce borrowing rates to encourage banks to lend to businesses, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises. So to deliver this, the TFF provided low-cost, fixed-rate 3-year funding to banks operating in Australia against high-quality collateral. After one extension, the TFF ultimately provided $188 billion of funding, equivalent to 6% of the stock of credit outstanding. It was closed to new drawdowns at the end of 2021, and the final funding matured as planned in the middle of 2024. The RBA review examined the TFF and drew some key lessons. It focused on the effectiveness of the TFF in delivering its goals rather than evaluating the overall policy stance chosen by the Reserve Bank. And they concluded that while the policy goals of the TFF were met, the design of the TFF involved trade-offs between the degree of support provided to the economy, the responsiveness to changing economic conditions, and the risk exposures or potential costs to the central bank. However, it's now clear that while banks drew down around $188 billion of the $213 billion total funding available from the facility, the major banks and mid-sized Australian banks took out all of their allowances, while smaller banks and foreign banks took over half of their total allowances. The review said it lowered the cost of funding and so lowered lending rates, especially fixed-term mortgage loans. But I believe this created a mortgage cliff problem later when rates started to rise. And we also know vast amounts of cash were lodged back at the RBA by the banks, directly supporting bank profits. There was actually very little evidence to indicate small businesses benefited from the TFF, by the way. The report said several banks materially increased their lending to SMEs. This latter group of banks reported in liaison that this was influenced by the incentive of the additional allowance. Other banks noted that they also tried to increase their lending to businesses, but were constrained by businesses' limited demand for credit. SMEs were also disproportionately in industries more severely affected by the pandemic, adversely affecting both supply of and the demand for credit. And then we should look at the $2.6 billion home builder stimulus. The Morrison government's $25,000 home builder grants for new homes and renovations created excess demand in a housing industry facing supply constraints, such as shortages of materials and labour, the wide-ranging inquiry said. This has been a significant contributor to inflation coming out of the pandemic, and the programme's focus on renovations rather than new builds added to the general housing shortage, the report said. These types of demand-side stimulus measures are largely not appropriate in pandemics where industries are facing supply constraints. By the way, separate Treasury analysis showed 70 to 80% of the more than 131,000 home builder grants were for new homes, with 20 to 30% for renovations as at February 2023. The cost of building a new home has surged 37% over the past 4 years, and of course that's threatening the Albanese government's efforts to build 1.2 million homes, and is also keeping upward pressure on interest rates. Builders are still working through a large backlog of home construction work that they committed to during the pandemic. More than 12,000 houses were approved but have not yet started as at June this year, according to the ABS. The contribution of housing, which includes dwellings and rents, to quarterly inflation has ranged between 20 and 50% since September 2021, the inquiry said. Inquiry co-author economist Angela Jackson said in hindsight, home builder overheated the housing sector exiting the pandemic, and lessons should be learned for future crises when supply was constrained. When home builder was announced in June 2020, the government estimated that it would support 27,000 homes. To be eligible, singles had to earn less than $125,000 and couples less than $200,000 per year. But ultimately, the program was wildly popular and the coalition government extended it. Grants were taken up by 4 times as many people as originally estimated, to more than 113,000 households. At least $260 million in payments was granted in 2022-23 after health restrictions were eased. And by the way, the early access to superannuation, which was capped at $10,000 per person per year, was not an appropriate policy response. And we agree, because we saw many households grabbing their super balances and running off to buy property, not using the money for everyday expenses as intended. So, all up, we can draw three conclusions. Too much taxpayer money was thrown at the problem in a poorly targeted inflation-stoking manner. This is why inflation loomed to the fore in the past few years. Second, too much was both directly and indirectly thrown at the housing market, stoking house prices and rents and exacerbating the distortions which were already in the market. No wonder prices have accelerated relative to incomes. No wonder, too, the construction sector is all but wrecked, with many firms subsequently failing while construction costs rise. And there is still a resistance to admit errors both from the government and from the RBA. Those in positions of responsibility may have done their best, but it was simply not good enough. We expect, and rightly so, demand more from our elected leaders. They collectively failed us, and the fallout continues to this day. The right critical observation is that trust will be hard to recover, and given recent behaviour, it may never be healed, which spells risks to democracy itself. Cue the Mad Bill. I'm Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics. Many thanks for watching, and I'll see you again next time.